The cold came first, then the engines. Then, according to the men who survived to describe it decades later, something the Waffen-SS almost never allowed themselves to say about an enemy. Respect. They had no tanks. They had no heavy artillery. They should not have been able to stop us. And yet, meter by meter, they did. That assessment, attributed after the war to an officer who served with the 1st SS Panzer Division, was not meant as praise. It was meant as an explanation, offered to men who wanted to know how Adolf Hitler's most feared armored spearhead, the column that had gunned down 84 American prisoners in a snow-covered field 3 days earlier, ended up stalled, encircled, and destroyed, not by other tanks, but by young men who jumped out of airplanes for a living. This is the story the Ardennes rarely tells. Everyone remembers Bastogne. Everyone remembers the surrounded town, the frozen infantry, the single word thrown back at a German surrender demand. Almost no one remembers what happened 40 kilometers to the north, where a different American division, dropped from the sky rather than trucked in, stood directly in the path of the most dangerous armored task force in the entire German order of battle, and broke it. The Germans already had a name for these men before that winter began. They had earned it months earlier, in the mud outside Anzio, when a captured diary from a German officer described them in 4 words that would follow the division for the rest of the war. American parachutists, devils in baggy pants. By December of 1944, the Waffen-SS was about to learn exactly what that reputation meant, in the forests and river valleys of Belgium, in cold that dropped ambitions as fast as it dropped temperatures. If you know the story of Bastogne, you know half the story of that December. This is the other half. This is what the SS said after they met the devils and paid for underestimating them. To understand what happened in those frozen valleys, you first have to understand what the Germans were trying to do and how close they came to succeeding. On the 16th of December, 1944, at 5:30 in the morning, more than 200,000 German soldiers moved forward along an 80-kilometer front through the Ardennes forest, the same wooded, hilly terrain the Wehrmacht had used 4 years earlier to shatter the French and British armies in 6 weeks. Adolf Hitler's plan, codenamed Watch on the Rhine, called for 3 armies to punch through the thin American line, cross the Meuse River, and recapture the port of Antwerp, splitting the Allied forces in 2 and forcing a negotiated peace in the West. It was, by 1944 standards, a fantasy. For the first 72 hours, it very nearly worked. At the tip of the spearhead rode the 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, once Hitler's personal bodyguard formation, now an armored juggernaut of Tiger and Panther tanks. Its forward element, a task force of roughly 5,000 men built around the 1st SS Panzer Regiment, was commanded by a 30-year-old lieutenant colonel named Joachim Peiper, a man whose entire career had been built on speed, aggression, and a willingness to accept casualties that other commanders found reckless. On the Eastern Front, his own men had given him a nickname, half admiring and half afraid, Blowtorch Peiper, earned during operations where villages were burned to enforce his timetable. His orders in the Ardennes were simple: drive west, ignore your flanks, reach the Meuse before the Americans can react. For 2 days, his column tore through the American rear, overrunning fuel depots, ambushing convoys, moving faster than anyone on the Allied side believed possible. Then, on the 17th of December, near a crossroads called Baugnez, Peiper's men captured roughly 100 American soldiers from a field artillery observation battalion. What happened next has its own name in history: the Malmedy massacre. 84 unarmed prisoners were machine-gunned in a snow-covered field. Word reached American headquarters within hours, and it changed something in how the war in the Ardennes would be fought from that point forward. The men sent to stop Peiper's column would not be fighting merely to hold a line. They would be fighting an enemy that had already shown, in writing and in blood, exactly what kind of surrender it was prepared to accept from the other side. By the 18th of December, Allied headquarters in Paris understood that the German advance was not a local counterattack but a full offensive aimed at splitting the Western Front in 2. General Dwight Eisenhower had almost no reserves left in Europe capable of moving quickly enough to matter. He had exactly 2, the 82nd Airborne Division and the 101st Airborne Division, both resting and refitting in camps outside Reims, France, after brutal fighting in Holland. Both were ordered to move within hours. The 101st went south, into a town called Bastogne, and became famous. The 82nd went north, directly into the path of Joachim Peiper's column, and very nearly vanished from the history books entirely. At Camp Sisson, France, on the evening of the 17th of December, The men of the 82nd Airborne Division were doing what soldiers do when they believe, however briefly, that the war might let them rest. Writing letters. Cleaning weapons out of habit rather than urgency. Arguing about card games. Many of them had jumped into Normandy in June. Many had jumped again into Holland in September, into the grinding 2-month campaign that history would call Operation Market Garden. They had earned, they believed, a winter indoors. The alert came just after dark. Trucks this time, not parachutes. There was no time to plan a jump, no time for rehearsal, no time even for proper winter clothing for many of the men, who climbed into open cargo trucks wearing field jackets meant for October, not a Belgian December that would soon drop to 20 degrees below zero at night. The convoy moved without headlights, engines straining in the cold, drivers navigating icy roads by memory and by the dim shapes of trucks ahead of them. Men slept sitting upright, packed shoulder to shoulder for warmth, jolting awake as the trucks lurched over shell craters and equipment abandoned by retreating American units. Commanding the division was Major General James Gavin, 37 years old, the youngest general officer in the American Army, a man who jumped into every combat operation alongside his troops rather than directing from behind a map table. Gavin had no illusions about the task. Fragmentary intelligence suggested German armor was already deep into Belgium, moving faster than anyone had planned for, and his division was being sent without adequate winter equipment, without its full artillery, without the days of preparation doctrine called for, to plug a gap against the single most dangerous armored formation in the German army. The Germans, however, already had a reputation to contend with, even if most did not know it yet. That diary entry from Anzio had circulated through German intelligence channels for months. Soldiers of the 1st SS Panzer Division moving into Belgium had heard, secondhand and imprecisely, that American paratroopers fought differently, that they did not retreat in the orderly fashion training manuals predicted, that they treated encirclement as an inconvenience rather than a crisis. It was a reputation built on Normandy hedgerows and Dutch polder country, about to be tested against tanks for the first time. By the early hours of the 19th of December, the lead elements of the 82nd Airborne reached Werbomont and fanned out along the Amblive and Salm river valleys, blocking every road a German armored column might use toward the Meuse. They arrived with rifles, machine guns, and bazookas meant as a last resort against tanks, along with whatever artillery could be scraped together in the chaos unfolding around them. What they did not have was time to dig in before the fighting began. One of the men riding in those trucks was Private First Class Thomas Whitfield, 19 years old, from a small farming town in Ohio, who had volunteered for the paratroopers in part because the extra $50 a month in jump pay meant something to a family that had gone without during the Depression years. Whitfield had jumped into Normandy as a replacement 2 weeks after D-Day and fought through the Holland campaign without a scratch, a fact his squadmates half-jokingly attributed to a rabbit's foot he kept sewn into the lining of his jacket. He would need considerably more than luck in the days ahead. The first contact came in darkness, the way most of the fighting in that river valley would. Reconnaissance elements of Kampfgruppe Peiper, probing west and south along the narrow roads threading through the valley towns, ran into paratrooper outposts near the village of Rehir and along the high ground overlooking the Amblive. What followed was not the kind of battle either side had trained for. There were no broad fronts, no clear lines. There were small groups of Americans dug into hedgerows and stone farmhouses, firing at armored vehicles they had no proper weapon to destroy, buying minutes rather than hours, and then doing it again a kilometer further back. A German panzer grenadier attached to the reconnaissance battalion later described the experience in an after-action account. "We expected to roll through," he said. "Instead, there were men in the trees who would not run and would not surrender, and kept shooting even when it made no tactical sense to keep shooting." The account captured something that would recur again and again in the days that followed. German soldiers who had broken through entire American infantry divisions in 72 hours suddenly found themselves fighting for individual farmhouses against men who treated retreat as a tactic to be used sparingly, not a reflex. South of the river, near Trois Ponts, Army engineers blew key bridges just ahead of Peiper's lead tanks, forcing a costly detour that burned precious hours in fuel. It was not paratroopers who destroyed those bridges, but it was the 82nd Airborne that held the high ground above the resulting traffic jam of Panthers and Tigers, backed up along narrow roads, exposed to artillery fire that forward observers, dropped into the chaos with radios and grid coordinates, called down with brutal precision. One German officer, reflecting after the war on those first days of contact with the 82nd, offered an assessment that would not have pleased his former superiors. Regular infantry, when flanked and outgunned, generally withdrew in an orderly fashion. As doctrine expected, he said. These men counterattacked instead. It was inefficient by our standards. It was also, we came to understand, extremely difficult to plan against. What the German command had budgeted for was resistance that could be calculated, flanked, and broken on schedule. What they got instead was resistance that refused the schedule entirely. To understand why the fighting along the Amblève developed the way it did, it helps to understand the two men whose decisions shaped nearly everything that followed. Joachim Peiper had built his reputation on the Eastern Front, where speed and ruthlessness were rewarded, and hesitation was the only unforgivable sin in mobile warfare. His entire plan for the Ardennes depended on one assumption, that resistance, wherever it appeared, would be disorganized, undersupplied, and temporary. On the American side, command at the small unit level fell to men like Colonel Reuben Tucker, who led the 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment, and to sergeants and privates whose names mostly disappeared from official reports. Whitfield, dug into a frozen foxhole above the Amblève with 3 other men, later gave an account that captured the texture of those days better than any general summary could. 3 days without proper sleep, boots frozen solid by morning. A single blanket shared among 4 men who took turns standing watch in cold that made rifle action stiffen and hands go numb inside gloves within minutes. An order from his platoon sergeant that he said he never forgot. Hold the position until told otherwise, and if no one tells you otherwise, that means hold it anyway. The difference between the two command philosophies produced strange, asymmetric battles. German tank crews, trained to expect infantry to break under armored assault, found paratroopers who let tanks roll past isolated positions and then attacked the accompanying infantry from the flanks and rear, cutting the armor off from its own support. A report attributed to a company commander in the 1st SS Panzer Regiment noted the pattern with evident frustration. The tanks advance, he wrote. The infantry following them does not arrive because it has been engaged from positions we believed cleared. This is happening with a regularity that suggests deliberate tactics, not luck. It was, in fact, deliberate. Gavin's doctrine, hammered into the division since Normandy, prioritized aggressive, decentralized action by small units over rigid adherence to a static line. Peiper was fighting an enemy trained to do the one thing his operational plan could not survive: refuse to behave predictably. By the 20th of December, the German advance in the northern sector had stalled into something like a siege in reverse. Kampfgruppe Peiper boxed into the Amblève Valley, running low on fuel, unable to break out along roads the 82nd Airborne now controlled from the high ground. One of those roads ran through a small crossroads village called Chenot, held by a German detachment with flak guns positioned to sweep the approach with overlapping fields of fire. The ground on either side was flat, open, and offered almost no cover for hundreds of meters in any direction. The order to take Chenot fell to 2 battalions of Tucker's 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment. There was no way to approach the village except across open ground, in daylight, directly into the guns. Commanders understood exactly what they were ordering. The alternative, leaving the crossroads in German hands, risked opening an escape route for the trapped panzer column and prolonging the fighting indefinitely. The attack went forward anyway, at a walk and then a run, across frozen fields turned to churned mud and ice by earlier shelling, men falling in the open with nowhere to take cover, medics crawling forward under fire because there was no other way to reach the wounded. The noise, survivors would later say, was the thing that stayed with them longest. The flat crack of the flak guns firing nearly horizontal, built for aircraft and now depressed to fire directly into advancing infantry, tore through the winter dusk with a sound unlike ordinary artillery. Tracers cut visible lines through the failing light. Men went down in 2s and 3s, and the lines behind them did not stop, did not turn back, closed the gaps left by the fallen, and kept moving toward the muzzle flashes. Whitfield went down 20 meters from the first row of houses, a shell fragment tearing through his left thigh, and later described the strange calm that settled over him as he watched his own blood darken the snow, certain for several minutes that he was going to die in that field, and finding, to his own surprise, that the fear had gone quiet somewhere along the way. A friend from his squad dragged him the last stretch to a stone wall while the assault continued past them both. It was the kind of attack military textbooks generally advise against, a frontal assault across open ground into prepared defensive fire, and it succeeded because the men making it refused to stop making it. A German account of the fighting at Chenot, attributed to a survivor of the garrison, described the final minutes before the position collapsed. They kept coming through fire that should have stopped any advance, he said. We had the guns. We had the position. It was not enough. By nightfall, the crossroads belonged to the Americans, though the cost had been severe, among the highest casualty rates the regiment would suffer in any single action of the entire war. The fight at Chenot would later earn the 504th a Presidential Unit Citation, one of the highest collective honors the American military can bestow, though few outside military history circles would ever learn the name of the village where it was earned. The capture of Chenot closed one more escape route in a trap that had been tightening around Kampfgruppe Peiper for nearly a week, and understanding why that trap worked explains something larger about how a lightly armed infantry force could strangle an armored task force that outgunned it in every conventional category. The first factor was fuel. Peiper's plan had always depended on capturing American fuel depots along his route, since his own logistics could not support the distances involved. When those depots were destroyed or evacuated, and paratrooper-directed artillery made resupply convoys nearly impossible to run, his tanks began running dry in exactly the terrain least suited for abandoning armor. Narrow valley roads with steep wooded slopes on either side, and no room to maneuver. The second factor was terrain itself. The same hills and river valleys that had allowed the breakthrough now worked against a stalled column, funneling every vehicle onto a handful of roads that American forces, holding the high ground, could observe and target with precision. The third factor, the one German reports returned to again and again, was the refusal of American paratroopers to fight the war German planning had assumed they would fight. An assessment attributed after the war to a senior officer in the German 6th Panzer Army summarized the failure with unusual bluntness for a man defending his own record. We planned for an enemy that would defend, then withdraw, then defend again, in a manner we could predict and exploit, he said. Instead, we met troops who counterattacked constantly, who did not consider their own encirclement a reason to stop fighting, and who used terrain more skillfully than we anticipated from an infantry-only force. This cost us the initiative and, eventually, the operation. It was a remarkable admission from an army built on the doctrine of overwhelming rapid maneuver. The plan had not failed for lack of firepower, but because the men in its path refused to follow the script written for them. By the night of the 23rd of December, bleeding into the 24th, with fuel exhausted, ammunition low, and every escape route either blocked or under fire, Joachim Peiper made the decision his entire career had been built to avoid. He ordered what remained of his command, roughly 800 men out of the nearly 5,000 who had crossed the start line a week earlier, to abandon their vehicles and walk out on foot through the forest, leaving behind dozens of Tiger and Panther tanks, immobile for lack of fuel, undamaged in combat but useless all the same. American troops who later moved through the abandoned column found tanks parked in orderly rows along the roadside, engines cold, turrets still traversed toward targets their crews had never had the fuel to reach. The destruction of Kampfgruppe Peiper marked the effective end of German hopes in the northern sector of the Ardennes offensive. It came through a combination of engineering demolitions, artillery, and armor from other American units converging on the pocket. But at the center of nearly every account sits the blocking actions and counterattacks of paratroopers who arrived with no armor of their own and fought one of the most feared formations in the German army to a standstill, using little more than rifles, bazookas, and a doctrine that treated retreat as a last resort. The casualty toll on both sides was severe. Estimates placed German losses in Kampfgruppe Peiper at well over half its original strength, with nearly all of its armor abandoned or destroyed. The 82nd Airborne Division suffered casualties that would not be fully counted for weeks, spread across a dozen separate engagements along a valley most Americans, then and now, could not locate on a map. Thomas Whitfield survived his wound at Chenot, was evacuated to a hospital in England, and returned to his unit in February, in time for the final push into Germany. He rarely spoke about that December in later years, though his daughter would say, decades afterward, that he kept a small piece of shell fragment in a drawer for the rest of his life and never explained to anyone why. The story that emerged from the Battle of the Bulge centered almost entirely on Bastogne, on the 101st Airborne, on a single defiant word shouted back at a surrender demand. Popular histories and eventually television dramas returned again and again to that southern siege, while the northern shoulder, where the offensive's most dangerous spearhead was actually destroyed, faded into a footnote. There are reasons beyond simple oversight. Bastogne offered a clean, symbolic narrative, a surrounded town, a defiant refusal, a relief column arriving just in time. The fight against Kampfgruppe Peiper was messier, spread across a dozen villages, blended with the actions of armored and infantry divisions alongside the paratroopers, and lacked a single unifying image for popular memory to attach itself to. But messiness is not the same as insignificance. A German General Staff assessment, compiled during post-war debriefings of captured officers, concluded that the failure to break through in the north, where the 82nd Airborne stood directly in Peiper's path, had done more to doom the Ardennes offensive than any single factor in the south. One captured officer summarized it in a sentence history books rarely quote. "We lost the race in the north before Bastogne even mattered," he said. There is a particular kind of erasure that happens not through denial but through neglect, when a true story simply gets crowded out by a more convenient one. For 80 years, the story of the Ardennes has belonged to a besieged town in the south, and the single word its defenders offered a surrendering enemy. 40 kilometers north, in river valleys most people will never visit, a different story was unfolding at the same time. German soldiers who had broken armies twice their size in France and swept through the American line in 72 hours ran directly into paratroopers who had jumped into two of the hardest campaigns of the war, and simply refused to do what the German plan required of them. They did not have tanks to match Peiper's Tigers, or the artillery reserves of a full infantry division. What they had was a doctrine that treated encirclement as a tactical problem rather than a crisis, a reputation earned months earlier in the mud of Anzio, and a willingness to attack across open, flat ground into enemy guns when the situation demanded it, regardless of cost. The Germans who survived those days along the Amblève did not describe an easy victory turned narrowly into defeat. They described an enemy that behaved in ways their training had not prepared them for, that turned every advantage of speed and armor into a liability the moment the terrain narrowed and the fuel ran low. Perhaps that is the real answer to the question this story began with. What the SS said, after facing American paratroopers at the Battle of the Bulge, was not a boast, and it was not propaganda. It was closer to a confession, offered by men who had believed, with good reason, that they possessed the finest armored spearhead in the German army, and discovered instead that an enemy without a single tank of its own could take that spearhead apart, meter by meter, farmhouse by farmhouse, until there was nothing left to do but abandon the vehicles and walk home through the snow. The devils in baggy pants had earned their name in Italy. In the frozen valleys of the Ardennes, they proved it had never been an exaggeration.